Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. So in keeping with trying to restock my pantries and freezers, I have found a great deal on pork, and this recipe actually is 2 years in the making. Almost 2 years. In June it will be 2 years. I found, like I said, a great deal on pork, so I picked up a couple of roasts. And I am going to finally get around to making this canning project, getting this canning project done. It is going to be Mississippi pot roast. So before I start any canning project, I make sure I have all my jars ready to go, check for any chips or anything like that, and I do wash in warm soapy water with some white vinegar. Now I also do my rings. I don't take my rings and my lids out of the box and put them straight on my jars. I wash them in that same warm soapy vinegar water, and I do use some warm water and put my lids in there just to soften up that compound. Some people say you can skip that step, but I do not. So here are the ingredients for my canning project today. I got everything laid out and ready to go. Now this is the ingredient that I got almost 2 years ago, and I was gonna make this and it got pushed to the side. So these are my peppuccinos. And then, of course, I have my roast. I picked up two. I picked up a smaller one, and I picked up a bigger 10-pound or just over 10 pounds. I have some broth here from the fridge that was left over from making dinner last night. And I always thought when it was this jelly sort of consistency, I was doing something wrong when I made my stock. And apparently this is pretty good when it makes that gelatin sort of consistency. So I guess I was doing something right. So the next thing I have is this better than bouillon. This is what I'm going to make my broth with. I guess I could get my homemade broth, but I wanted to use this up. And then I have some ranch seasoning mix that I mixed up myself. And this is what I'm going to make Mississippi pot roast with. So the first thing I'm going to do is wash my meat and pat it dry. That's why the fat side looks kind of patterny. That's from my paper towel. So this pork shoulder butt roast has a bone in it. So what I'm going to do is just take my knife and very carefully just run it along that bone. And all you have to do is just follow the bone right along, right around it, and it will come right out. Now, make sure your knife is sharp. You want to sharpen your knife here and start with a very sharp knife. And just take your time and follow the bone right around, and it's easy to come out. This is the first time I've actually done this big of a roast, but just take your time and go right around the bone and it will come out really easily. Okay, so I got both of my bones out of both roast, and to be 100% honest, I called my husband. I thought I was going to cut myself, but if you take your time and just go around, the first one I did pretty easily, but yeah, I called my husband and he did it. So now that I have the bone out, I want to take some of this fat off the top. It is quite a bit what I thought was quite a bit, and I started to take it off, and this knife is really sharp, and as you can see, I'm still having a problem. What my problem is, it's really sharp and I'm afraid I'm going to cut myself, which I tend to do with sharp knives. But I started cutting it and I was like, you know what, it really doesn't look like that much. So I actually switched up tactics and started to just cut it up in chunks. So I'm going to show you how I'm doing that. Just cut it in slices and then cut it up in chunks. And what I found was when I laid that slice on the cutting board, I can see the cap of the fat, the top of the fat batter. And some of the pieces I actually did cut off. I just laid it on top of the cutting board and cut it down individually. A little bit more work than if I would have cut it off the top, which I did get a little bit off the top. As you can see, it's kind of crazy janked up there, but you know what? It worked. But if you lay it down on the cutting board and cut each slice, if you see the fat is too much and you want to cut the slices, the fat off there, then that worked easier for me. And then trying to cut it off the top when it was in a whole slab. And if you look here, I've cut it up in chunks, and I took the fat off each chunk that way, and it was a lot easier doing that. So this is the biggest of the two roasts, and I'm cutting this into about 1-inch chunks, and I'm going to put it on my pan, and we're going to roast this in the oven for about 30 minutes or so until it's kind of like crispy and golden brown somewhat on the top. So this is the bigger of the two roasts, and I'm hoping it will be enough to fit in my 7.5-pint jars. So I'm figuring a little over a pound per 1.5-pint jar, if that makes sense. So here it is. I couldn't fit it on one pan, so I put it on two. I'm going to put it in the oven at 375 for about 30 minutes till it gets a little bit crispy at the top, sort of browned edges. So while that's in the oven, I'm going to deal with the other roast. And yes, I washed it and patted it dry, as you can see. And I'm going to put these into wide mouth pint-sized jars. Now what I did was just a teaspoon of salt, and I use pink Himalayan sea salt in the bottom. You can use pickling salt, you can use Redmond's real salt I've used before. You don't want to use iodized salt, so any kind of sea salt or pickling salt will work. So again, I'm going to just dice it up into those 1-inch cubes, and I'm going to do this just a plain pork. So I already have the Mississippi pork roast, and I'm hoping to get 7.5 pints out of that, and I'm hoping to get 8 wide mouth pints out of just the regular pork. So here it is in the jars, and I'm going to de-bubble it. Now that basically just take something other than metal, plastic or silicone like I'm using here, and just debubble it around the sides, just taking out any air bubbles that might be in there. And I'm going to wipe my rims of my jars with a bit of vinegar, and that's just white distilled vinegar, to get any residue, any grease from the meat off of my rims, because you want to have a really good seal. This can make the difference between whether your jars seal or not. And I go around a second time, and in between I'm actually turning my paper towel around. I know I'm doing that off camera, but I'm turning it around to use a clean side of the paper towel. So this is a raw pack. I am not adding any liquid to it. It will produce its own liquid. So I'm going to put it on my lids now. I am pulling them out of my pot with warm water that I put them into just to soften up that compound and hopefully increase my chances of a good seal. So on goes my lids. And then I finger tighten my rims. You don't want to crank them down. You want to put them on and then stop when you feel resistance. So that's it. Just put them on, as you can see, and stop when you feel resistance. That's it. I had a problem in the beginning with this. It's definitely a technique to it. So into my canner, I am using my electric canner for this because my other canner has other stuff in it. I have several canning projects going this day, and because this is a small batch, I am utilizing my small batch canner in my electric canner, and this works out. While I was setting up my small batch canner with the other part of the pork roast, I got this out of the oven. As you can see, the tips are a little bit browned, and this took about exactly a half an hour or so, and I am ready to start filling my jars. Now I have 7.5 pints jars, and I want to see how much of this meat I can get in it. So all I'm doing is spooning my meat in. I'm actually using a slotted spoon to just keep some of that liquid in the tray. And I'm just going to fill these to about 1-inch headspace, and that's that bottom line on the jar itself. So once I got my jar filled to that 1-inch headspace, I'm just going to take my silicone spatula handle and just press them down a little bit. I want to get a bit more meat into these. It's very loosely packed, so I'm just going to move that meat around, not really packing it, but just sort of manipulating it so I can get a few more pieces into my jars. And here they are. I am happy with the level of them. They are still 1-inch headspace, and I haven't debubbled them yet. I will do that at the end when I have the liquid in them. So now I'm just putting in a teaspoon, a level teaspoon of my ranch mix. Now this is a DIY ranch mix. I will put it, the recipe that I used, that I found online probably about 5 years ago or so, and I've been using it ever since, and I will put it in the description box below if you want to use this dry mix that I used. And you don't want to use like the commercial ranch mix because it has thickeners in it, and you don't want to actually can with thickeners, so nothing like cornstarch and that sort of stuff. You can thicken your gravy when you go to open it. So the next thing I'm going to do is put a little bit of that juice from off the pepperoncinos into the jar itself. Now, it was a specific amount. We like that sort of pickly, sort of hot sort of flavor. So I actually use pretty much all of this juice in the 7 jars that I had. And then I put in my pepperoncinos, and again, we like spicy, so I put pretty much the majority of all that jar into these 7.5 pint size jars. So now I'm just ladling in my warm broth, and I am actually using vegetable broth in this. I had the mixture of my home canned broth and that better than bouillon broth, and that's how I made this broth. So for the broth portion, I will tell you that you're probably going to need about 14 cups, depending on how full your jars are. This is how much of the pepperoncinos that I have left, not a lot. And this is how much meat I had left from that 10-pound roast. And I have 7 of the 1.5 pint size jars. Now this is where I'm debubbling it. Just go around the sides, you know, release any air bubbles that might be there when you put the liquid in. And I'm just using the back of my silicone spatula. You don't want to use anything metal here. Then I'm wiping my rings, my jars, with white vinegar and a paper towel. I know I'm not showing it too good, but I am folding over my paper towel and just using other sides of it, so it's not the same side actually touching the jar. I'm folding it over periodically. Fold it over and use a clean side to wipe the jars of any kind of liquid or any kind of grease that might have touched the rim, because you want to keep that really clean so you have really good seals. You don't want to do all this work and then your jars fail to seal, because that's a really bummer. But if that does happen, you can put it in the fridge and use it over the next couple of days. You don't want to just throw it out. It's too much money nowadays to just throw out food like this. If it doesn't seal, just put it in your fridge and use it up within a day or two of you canning it. Even if it sits overnight, it will be okay, because it's coming down off of pressure. Unless you're in a really hot climate and it gets really hot, then I guess all bets are off. But if you're in a pretty well-controlled environment, like 60, 70 degrees, and it sits overnight and you check it in the morning, it will be fine to put it in your fridge and use it up in a day or two. So I have 7 of the 1.5 pint size jars, and that's what fits into my 23-quart Presto canner. So as you can see, the 7 jars are in here, and I'm going to get to pressure canning them. So this should be one of the things you check first before you even start your canning project. And I did already, and I probably should have mentioned it at the beginning of the video when I was washing up my jars. You want to check your equipment, your canner. You want to make sure your seal is correct. You want to make sure your vents are clear. You want to make sure everything is good for you to use that canner on any specific date. You also want to get your regulator checked by your extension office in your area every year to make sure it's holding correct pressure. Now, if you got one of those jigglers, then yeah, that's a different story. But with the dial gauge, you want to make sure your dial gauge is checked by your extension office in your area at least once a year. So I've checked everything. I've checked my seals. I've checked my vents. Everything is clear and I'm ready to proceed. The water level in your canner is specific to your canner. For me and my Presto canner, my 23 quart, there's a line in the bottom. The very bottom line is where I fill my water to. Some say put a quart in, some say put 3 quarts in. It's all specific to your canner. And your manual will tell you that. Something you should have read before you started your canning project. If you didn't, refer back to it. It will tell you exactly how much water to put in your canner. And as far as your gasket maintenance, I oil mines with olive oil. You can use vegetable oil, whatever you have. Probably about every 2 times I use it, and I wash it every single time. And did you hear that knock just now? Try not to knock your dial gauge as I just did. Something you don't want to do. So on goes my top. There is a arrow there that shows you where to put it down and put it into the lock position. So now you want to bring it up to temp as slowly as possible. I usually do it on about 4. Now I have a glass top, so that's approximately medium heat. Now you want to let this come up to temp to where it's venting a steady stream of steam. And once you get your steady stream of steam, you want to let it vent for 10 minutes. So once your 10 minutes is up, your vent in front will pop up and stay up. You might see a little bit of water coming out like mine is. That's just the way my pressure canner works. Once that happens, you will put your weight on and will slowly start to build pressure. Now this will also depend on your altitude to sea level. So with mine, my altitude is about 900 and something feet. So I pressure can at 11 pounds of pressure. It's a quick Google search to find out your altitude to sea level. So once I reach that 11 pounds of pressure, I start my timer. So I'm actually doing pork and it's 75 minutes. And you want to maintain 11 pounds of pressure that whole 75 minutes. You don't want it to drop down any lower than what your pounds of pressure is. So you want to make sure you maintain that pressure. And if you do drop below your recommended pounds per pressure in your altitude, you have to reset your timer to the beginning. And I've had that happen once to me, actually, on this recent canning. And I walked away for a second. You really shouldn't walk away from your canner. And it had dropped down to just under 11. It was off the 11. So I had to restart it. It was only 5 minutes into canning, so it wasn't too bad. Can you imagine 70 minutes into canning and it drops over pressure? At that point, I think I would just leave it and put it in my freezer and use it that way. Because having to restart it at that point, I think the meat would probably be, unrecognizable at the end. So I've never had that happen to me that far into canning, the canning process. So hopefully it never happens to you. So you want to be right there and keeping an eye on it. Especially with me, with my electric stovetop, the way it fires can make it go off of pressure pretty easily. I have to constantly adjust it sometimes. Sometimes it's beautiful, other times not so much. So you want to be close by your canner. So since I'm sticking close to the stove, I decided to make dinner because I have that leftover pork roast. I just might as well make up this Mississippi pork roast and see how it tastes. I've had it once before and it was really delicious, so that's why I decided to can it up. And I'm just going to start with some lard in the pan and make a roux. This is where you want to add your thickener. You don't want to add it in your jar. So I have some of the broth left over and I'm just making the sauce portion of it. And I will say, I'm not sure if this is exactly how it should be made. I didn't really check that. So this is my version of the Mississippi pork roast. And this is what I'm going to go with. So I'm adding in my ranch, DIY ranch dressing. Now you're supposed to put buttermilk in here. I don't have any buttermilk at this moment because I am still trying to restock my pantry. And I don't have any, and I don't want to open up some powdered buttermilk that I have in the pantry just for this little bit. So I think it's going to be okay though. I think we can do without the buttermilk in this. And I did add a little bit of brown gravy mix to make it a little browner. So in goes my peppers. This is what I had left in that jar, and a little bit of the juice. And I will say, I tasted this. It smells awesome. I tasted it and it smells so delicious. It's not even funny. So I'm just going to add in what was left of the roast. And I did add some juices off of those pans into this. I'm not exactly sure you should do that either, but I'm saying why waste it? And this is the fat that I did get off of it. I'm going to put it into my freezer and render it later on. I don't feel like dealing with it right now. So here is what it looks like. I served it with a side of carrots and over mashed potatoes. And yes, it's not your eyes. My potatoes are very yellow. I actually add turmeric in my potatoes sometimes. So sometimes I use sweet potato mashed potatoes, but this time I just added some turmeric for a little different taste. So it's the next day, and here is the Mississippi pot roast and the just plain pork, and everything's sealed. So what I'm going to do now is take off the rings, and I'm going to wash them up. Now, I may do this a little differently than other people do. I will say this turns out pretty good. I can't wait to try it a little later. And I do wash my jars in the sink with a little bit of warm water and vinegar and a little bit of just a drop of dishwashing liquid. And that's how I clean my jars. You can wipe them with vinegar if you like. This is the way I clean mine. So as you can see, these roasts were $1 a pound, and with my additional discount, I actually got them for under $1 a pound, which I thought was a really good deal. Maybe you can find them in your area for less than that. This was at a restaurant supply store. So if you're looking for deals, maybe you want to, if you have a restaurant supply store in your area, maybe you want to check them out. This was Gordon's, and they are open to the public. You don't need to have a business in order to go in there. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and click that notification bell to be notified when I upload videos. And remember, stay safe and keep prepping.